cancel William Shakespeare? Shakespeare has been here for 400, 500 years, and some pinhead bureaucrat in Washington is not going to get rid of it.
I think the idea is to wipe out our history, wipe out our traditions, our values, everything, with the idea of just having whatever they are doing, which is terrifying.
I wonder how these people who run all kinds of corrupt governments here, I mean, in America, do they never look back at what they've done during the day?
Right now, it's all about Western civilization in terms of great history, great literature, great values. Our whole mission is to inspire people with whatever we do.
Hey, welcome back everyone. Now, cancel culture is going after just about everything right now, from Peter Pan and Dumbo to Pepe Le Pew and Speedy Gonzales. And here to talk with us about cancel culture and its effect on creativity are two folks who spent most of their lives in Hollywood. We have here Clarence Felder and Chris Weatherhead. And so both of you, real pleasure having you on Crossroads.
What a pleasure to be
Thank you
with
for having us.
And so first off, you've spent your lives in Hollywood. For a lot of people, it seems like a difficult path to take. One, because I know you folks are pretty upfront with your values, which are not really, say, compatible with what a lot of people think Hollywood is. And I'm curious, just to start, how have you seen Hollywood change over the years? Chris, I know, for example, that you were more on the left in Hollywood for a while, and you made a shift. And how did you see Hollywood change?
Well, first of all, for both of us, it was New York. And that was 22 years for him and 14 years for me, and then Hollywood after that. And I would say that before we got to Hollywood and while we were in Hollywood, you really didn't want to wave a flag about being a conservative, being a Christian. I joined several groups that were kind of praying in secret, writers, directors, and producers was one group, and then there was a group of actors. And you just had to try to work through it. You had to just try to pray your way through it. And of course, my agent wanted me to read all these scripts and get involved in various things, where half the time I would read 2 or 3 pages and I'd just be throwing it across the room. And I just thought, wow, I had a dream to have artistic control. And you don't get that in Hollywood unless you have the money, the money. So we didn't get that till we got to South Carolina, and I'm just so grateful. I met Clarence in New York doing Shakespeare, fell in love with him at a Shakespeare festival, and then by the time we were in California, then we were married. So we were able to kind of inch our way into a little bit of creative control and try to just read the river.
Well, and this is interesting because a lot of people would interpret this more leftist view as it's something that would allow for more creativity, because that was the narrative during the whole Hollywood blacklist years, is how could you try to restrict creativity? How could you try to restrict artists? How can you try to restrict these things? But do you find that side of things lends more to the restrictions on this?
Well, certainly it did to a certain extent. However, I found my experience a little different from that, because for some reason I just would always say carry my Bible onto the set with me, and I would take it, even when I did the series with John Ritter for 2 years, I would have the Bible, and the word got around, he's one of those Christians, and they would avoid me at first, but when anybody would have a problem, some kind of emotional upset, or in their home or in relationships, they'd sidle up to me. And I remember I was doing a guest starring thing on Designing Women with a beautiful star, Dixie Carter. I had worked with her in New York doing some plays there, and she was a wonderful person. But they had a lady, I won't name her, but she didn't say much when I met her and stuff. But then when we were sitting on the set having a cup of coffee, she started saying, "Oh man, I really need some help." And that led into, I became sort of a psychiatrist for the next half hour. And people, let me tell you, people really respect Christians and Christianity. They really do. When they are in trouble, they don't pray to a tree. They pray to God, right? I mean, and it was so clear. Now, PR and all that stuff, yeah, and politics. Listen, politics is worse. Politics, that is the heresy these days, more than.
Well, then this is interesting because in Hollywood we often, I've talked to a lot of people in Hollywood, and they say, if you're religious these days, Christian especially, you're kind of outcast.
No, well, that wasn't my experience. Although occasionally I would get direct frontal attacks. You know
what I left out? I did leave out my years in San Francisco, Haight-Ashbury, the drug culture, a real culture of death. And I had studied in London with the wonderful Brewster Mason of the Royal Shakespeare Company. I'd come back to California, and somebody had recommended me for the American Conservatory Theater. And at that point, it was 1970, 71, 72. And Haight-Ashbury was, I lost days, weeks. People died. I'm very grateful to be alive, and I believe that God was looking out for me during that time. And when I left that world, or was maybe taken out of that world, and somehow we got to New York, and within a few years of being in New York, I became a Christian, and that just, that was the first big turning point. And then when Clarence was taken to Bulgaria through the Actors Theater of Louisville at that time, they were doing some exchange stuff, believe it or not, in communist Bulgaria. So he goes to Sofia, and he's there, living there for like 6 weeks, and he saw what communism was up close, very personal. There is a film called The Lives of Others.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And it really spoke to us after he had been to Bulgaria.
I've heard of this, about the Stasi.
Anyone interested who's a director, writer, producer, actor, these people lived under communism and tried to be creative. And when you were asking about cancel culture and censorship, it is so devastating, the thought of just, I think the idea is to wipe out our history, wipe out our traditions, our values, everything, with the idea of just having whatever they are doing, which is terrifying. And so all of the things that we have been working on since New York and LA and South Carolina for over 25 years now, it's all about Western civilization in terms of great history, great literature, great values, inspiring. Our whole mission is to inspire people with whatever we do. So everything we've done has been something that we were proud of, which was not the case in New York and LA necessarily.
However, I would say our first feature was called All for Liberty. And it was about a South Carolinian patriot during the Revolution.
His 6th great-grandfather.
Here in South Carolina. And he was German-Swiss and a really tough nut. He
had no slaves.
He was over 60 and he started fighting this stuff. They were religiously opposed to slavery. That's why they came and they left Europe and came here and settled in South Carolina. But we began with that movie, and we actually won an award before we had officially released it. Somebody had grabbed it at a film festival. But what really amazed me was that we premiered the movie in Beijing.
It was part of an exchange program. So one of our producers went to Beijing.
But they loved it.
And a lot of people wanted to see it, and then all of a sudden this big axe sort of came down. Teachers and students who had seen it, and then...
But see, for them, they're the heroes. It was a revolution. And fighting the same kind of totalitarian corruption.
From the British.
I wonder how these people, seriously, I wonder how these people who run all kinds of corrupt governments here, I mean, in America, particularly on the federal level or the state level. Do they never look in mirrors? Do they never look back at what they've done during the day? I mean, cancel William Shakespeare?
Cancel Frederick Douglass?
I mean,
we've been touring a play about Frederick Douglass for 3 years.
That's nuts.
Shakespeare. A lot of what we do is Shakespeare, or
Well,
T.S.
at
Eliot,
least
C.S. Lewis.
there's certain people that they'll never cancel.
Yeah.
Shakespeare has been here for 400, 500 years, and some pinhead bureaucrat in Washington is not going to get
Well,
rid
you know,
of
the real irony. I'm going to push for canceling Marx, because if you want to talk about racism,
Cancel Marx.
Oh, yeah.
Cancel
he
communism.
was full on racist.
Oh,
You're right. He was
Full
such
out.
a racist.
I'm
Full
all
out.
for canceling Marx. He was about hatred and racism. You know?
Yeah,
Yeah.
he used to scream
Look-
curses in the street in London, screaming at
Yeah.
people.
Cancel Marx.
Paul Johnson wrote a great book called Intellectuals, and he takes apart a
lot of different writers.
the poets, writers, everybody from Ernest Hemingway to Rousseau and back and forth. And all he does is say, this is what they wrote and this is what they did.
Yeah, this is why
Here.
they were famous, but this is who they were really.
Yeah. So anyway.
And,
yeah.
and that's an important picture that people don't pay attention to, unless you're on the side that they want to cancel, ironically.
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
I say no censorship. I mean, there are things that I would love to utterly destroy, but I do not believe in censorship of any kind, and neither does Clarence.
No,
We
I
talked
don't.
about this a lot while we were still in LA. It just doesn't make sense. Free societies do not tolerate censorship, flat out.
And this is an important point, I think, because it is that lack of censorship that allows free discussion on things, including things that are not good.
Of
But
course.
by,
Yeah.
but by discussing them, people can
Make a decision.
Well, and they can root out those ideas by presenting better ideas. But only when society can discuss good ideas and bad ideas can good ideas overcome bad ideas.
We were doing a play in the southern part of the state here, and part of it we were brought in, paid to bring it in, and it was called The Road Home. It was about the experiences during the Civil War of various people, all
North
kinds of
and
people.
South and,
Both
you
and
know,
everything.
it was
And,
like a-
you know, we care about reality and we care about correctness of costumes and weapons and all the rest of it. Well, this high school was supposed to come and see it, and they had a bunch of historians with it, but the high school's passed because the principal said the sight of a Confederate uniform would destroy
No matter what the
psyche
story was.
of the students. Like they don't know, you know?
Yeah.
And then how
know.
do you do that? How do you tell the story about the freeing of the slaves
You
and
can't.
emancipation
You can't tell
if you can't even show history anymore?
No, it's
Well,
just
that
ridiculous.
brings us to our second feature, which is John Laurens' War. And we discovered John Laurens while we were working on the very end of All for Liberty. And to know that this white kid from Charleston, who was the son of a slaveholder, who is a very enigmatic person, I'll mention him in a minute, but the fact that John started fighting slavery when he was still in Switzerland, he was being educated there, and he writes his father in Charleston, South Carolina, saying, "Father, I hear all this about becoming free in America and getting rid of the British rule." Well, we can't do that unless we free our slaves. We will be considered the greatest hypocrites if we don't free our slaves before the end of the American Revolution. So his father was saying, you know, just stay in law school, and he was in London. He went from Switzerland to London, and in 1777, John said, "Forget it, I'm coming." So he comes to South Carolina, and then by that time, through a strange series of events, his father, Henry Laurens, played by Clarence, was chosen to be the president of the Continental Congress. Now, that's a whole long story. But he deposits his father in Philadelphia and races to Valley Forge to tell General Washington, "I'm here, I'm going to fight like hell." And he does. He becomes a top aide with Alexander Hamilton and the Marquis de Lafayette, and he's training troops with the Marquis, and he's doing stuff, and he's writing stuff, and he ends up getting wounded in 4 major battles. But along the way, he is spending every spare moment trying to end slavery in America. He spends about 7 years before he is suddenly ambushed by the British down here in South Carolina in 1782. He's 27 years old, and had he not been killed then, we believe, a lot of us who studied him, he would have been a president of the United States. He would have been a very, very powerful character. He should be like Ben Franklin or Alexander Hamilton. He has a place in our history. And we're hoping that this 60-minute film that's won a lot of awards, and it's about to be released in spring of 2021, we hope to finally get him in the history books.
And this is important because the only reason we can tell stories like this is because history is still open to us. The books of history are still open to us. I heard recently that even libraries in some places are going to start throwing out books more than 5 years old.
Oh no!
And this has me terrified because I'm like, man, I need to go buy all the classics while I still can.
Yeah.
You know what happens when even your ability to research history has been canceled?
Well, see, again, I think the instinct for storytelling in the human animal is so strong, and in our minds and in our hearts, and it's a God-given gift, is to tell stories to each other, and then eventually you start acting them out, and then
you make decisions.
The wonderful Catholic Church during the medieval times copied out those Greek and Roman scripts and stories and books. If it hadn't been for those monks there laboring by candlelight, we wouldn't have Western civilization. It's a fact. So you can't cancel something like that.
And this is important too. Actually, I have a Chinese friend who was telling me that the way traditional classic Chinese education worked, of course they had the 4 books, you know, like the book of ethics in terms of how to hold yourself. They had the book of poetry. They had the Confucian classics that talked about ethics and how to hold yourself and deal with regular life. But a lot of the stories, a lot of the values were communicated through stories. And that was how they
That's
really
how Jesus
relayed
did
a lot
it.
of this. Yeah, and so the power of story is actually it's significant,
it's
not
immense.
just to Western civilization, but to all civilizations.
Yeah, we had, because of the COVID stuff, we were going to celebrate our 25th
anniversary
here
in South Carolina.
And then COVID hit, and no plays, no live things. No, we had
We
a
have
whole
been
list.
non-essential for a year.
But the humanities, see, once again, somebody kind enough at the humanities said to her when we requested some grants, we put them down on tape and shot them individually.
I
in
put
the
actors
studio.
into a recording studio, one at a time, and Clarence and myself and our main group of writers and actors picked great speeches, great stories. So one of them is called Calls to Greatness U.S. History, and that's 14 heroes that people get to meet from the American Revolution to 1968. So we matched actors to speeches, and we didn't know what was going to happen. It was COVID time. We could all be dead. So we just kept working every day. And then we did something called Calls to Greatness English Literature. So we started with Shakespeare and went all the way up to great poets, Langston Hughes, Paul Laurence Dunbar. We had T.S. Eliot, and just a lot of fun doing this. It helped us. I lost my sister during this time, and it helped me overcome the loss. We couldn't even have a funeral in California. We still haven't been able to. So we got these actors one by one with great material, and we found that we were all feeling better.
Yeah,
you know,
we
we
really
were
were, yeah.
able to get through this.
And so what is the motivation of kind of finding these old stories and retelling them? You know, what is it in these stories that you feel is of value to people? Because, you know, this is there's two sides to Hollywood, right? Two sides to entertainment, whether it's Shakespeare or classical literature.
Yeah.
Sure.
One side is just the interesting story. The other side is the principle or the value that it kind of relays to us.
Well, for me, I'll tell you, for me, they're one and the same. You can't have a principle if you don't have a good story.
Yeah.
And what makes a good story? There are two things for me. One is conflict. Without it, you don't have a story that has much interest. And the second thing is relational, familial, friends, all those great Greek words like phileo and agape, and it's about love, really, when it comes down to it.
It's about
for
God.
me. But if you got a great story, problems. It reminds me of a funny story. One of my heroes, film actors, is Duke Wayne. John Wayne, I think, was vastly underrated as an actor.
The Searchers.
But he really was able, he said, if you just think about what you're supposed to be thinking about and feel what you're supposed to be feeling, then they'll see it in the eyes on the camera. The camera comes and finds it. But if you don't, the camera also can see that too, and it knows.
So whether it's theater or whether it's film or whether it's television or podcast, it's a way of communicating what matters. We all, I've been teaching acting for about 45 years in New York and LA and here, and I'm very, very focused on motive. When you say the motive, if you look at a person's motive for what they're doing, Aristotle said, when he teaches about tragedy, he would remind actors, actors are taught this, it doesn't matter what you say about your character. It doesn't matter what other people say about you. Who you are is the actual actions that you have taken. That's who you are.
It doesn't matter why you do something either, in my opinion, as far as your character is concerned. C.S. Lewis said the same thing. What matters is what you do. Finally.
I spent about 8 years in California in the prison system and helping with rehabilitation. It was a Christian group. Everybody was trying to help people program well in the prisons, and the stories that I learned during those years. And it was great because I could be up at one of the prisons and then be driving back to LA to shoot something. And some of those people that were in prison were more free because they had figured it out. They had figured out life, and they were gonna make good choices when they got out. And I'd drive back down to LA and I'd be in the company of people who were imprisoned by money, drugs, sex, power, whatever. And I felt like God had given me the ability to just see, it's very sad that people could spend their whole lives just in prison. And they're not behind bars.
And actually, I want to mention too that I know you folks are talking about some of the work you've done. You were telling me about this book you're doing about King Kamehameha. And this is interesting because you were saying, I'm mixed race, but being part Hawaiian, I love the story of King Kamehameha. And it bothers me, of course, that you have a lot of great stories from other cultures that I don't think will ever be told. Really, if you look at a lot of Western, supernatural stories on TV that are real popular, they're based on like Grimm and they're really kind of a narrow look of fantasy and so on. But if you go into a lot of other ancient cultures, you have so much to work with and so many interesting and great stories that nobody even talks about. And you were mentioning that one of the problems you face is that by even writing about another culture at this point, you're worried about facing cancel culture.
Yeah, I'm ready for people to attack me being a white kid surfer from a haole from Newport Beach, writing about Hawaiian culture. But Hawaii has been a major part of my family. A major, beautiful part of my family. And so studying it, and because I am a white kid from Newport, I might have done more study than some other people might have done, but I was so concerned. I wanted to just get to whatever was really the truth. I've always felt if you just tell me the truth, I'll figure out what to think about it, but just give me the truth. And so I wanted to give people a feeling about what it was like. There's a lot of supernatural aspects. They were doing human sacrifice. That was a real part of 1790 to 1792. But also there was the Kauva. The Kauva that was the slave culture. And so I just want to tell people the truth. And then if somebody attacks me for it, I'll say, well, go ahead, do your own research, and I'd love to read your book. I am open to whatever somebody would like to say. I just want to tell the story that fascinated me.
Well, and there's two different views, I think, on creativity. There are people who want to introduce ideas and introduce stories and create movies and films and books and create discussion around them. And then there's people who want to tear it down.
Yes.
And this is really, when you get to the root of it, the two sides of, I'd say, the entire discussion around cancel culture. Is there's one side that says you can challenge ideas by introducing new ideas. You can challenge history and portrayals of history by introducing new portrayals of history. And that is how I think traditional cultures debated and decided which values and which stories should be kept.
Yes.
Whereas this new culture of cancel culture looks to instead tear down everything that's created, silence people, forbid speech, forbid creativity, and that is the direction things are really going in now.
You're reminding me of my years in San Francisco. I have told people that I feel a lot of what's happening now is because of my generation. And basically, we were just ripping everything down. We were just ripping everything down, and we had nothing good to replace it with. And that's what terrifies me with cancel culture. If they said, "Oh, don't do this," read about this. Well, fine. We can broaden our horizons, but to destroy and not to replace it with something good, wholesome, loving. I can't even. Well, I'm not going to live my life that way. Whatever I've got left, I'm going to be telling those good stories we were talking about.
This is important. I'm thinking about why stories matter to people.
Oh, yeah.
And I think one of the biggest things is that stories inform us of the consequences of decisions and actions.
That's
right. Without having to go through them ourselves.
Yeah.
And sometimes having that broad view of this person did this and this is what happened, that a king could make a poor decision and despite wealth and success and everything, be torn apart from within. Right?
Everything.
That is such a powerful message. That even Romeo and Juliet wasn't a love story. It was a story about how conflicts between two groups can destroy love.
I know,
that was, that's such a powerful.
And that's happening
message.
today.
We were looking at somebody was making satire about writing Romeo and Juliet and how Shakespeare thought about it and said, "Oh boy, I got these two young lovers and they get separated and it's horrible, looks bad for a while, but then they come and they get together and then, well, I think I'll kill them." And then the structure of the government says to the two families, the reason for the problem, look, see what you did? By doing what you chose to do against each other, you killed these beautiful young people for no reason, except your own pride.
So he orders them to now have a discussion, have a good, active discussion. This is post-play, right? He says, all right, in order to fix these two houses that created these star-crossed lovers, people have to finally get together, have a discussion, talk about how to make it work. And that's what we want to be able to do. We want to just have people be able to communicate with each other. And we love, I would say, our mission statement for ever since we've been producing and having total creative control, by the way. We have wanted to create situations that entertain, but challenge people to think, to feel, to make decisions. People coined a phrase about us about 15 years ago, that it was life-changing theater and film. we have film camps for young filmmakers. So the whole idea is to help change somebody's life, help them make a better decision, which is what I was doing in the prisons, which was what we were trying to do in California as Christian conservatives. Take what you have and use it and go as long as you can. I mean, we're not going to retire. He's 83, he's 82, I'm 73, and we figure, hey, maybe in this time period, we might have another 15 or 20 years, right?
Never know.
Chris, Clarence, real pleasure. Real pleasure.
Wow,
Crossroads.
it's a pleasure.
Thank you
for
so
me,
much for what
actually.
you're doing.
Yeah, thank you.